Have you ever noticed, like, how some people just seem to disappear in their relationships?
Oh, yeah.
They're giving and giving,
Yeah.
always putting everyone else first,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of a sudden it's
Yeah.
like they've vanished.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to do a deep dive into this whole idea
Okay.
that our source calls self-abandonment.
Interesting.
We'll look at the patterns, how it affects relationships,
Okay.
and most importantly, how to build those connections where everyone thrives,
Right.
not just survives.
And the source is really cool because it doesn't look at self-abandonment as like a weakness or a flaw, but more like a pattern
Okay.
that we kind of develop, often with good intentions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, we've been told that love equals sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more we give, the better the relationship.
Right.
But what if that's not true at all?
Exactly. And this source is fascinating. It's like a personal journal, but with all the psychological insight.
Oh, wow.
And it argues that the real strength in a relationship comes from authenticity and setting healthy boundaries.
So let's unpack that a bit.
Oh.
What exactly is self-abandonment?
Well, according to the source, it's when you're constantly ignoring or downplaying your own needs and values,
Okay.
and even your own truth, just to avoid conflict, to maintain the relationship, or get validation from other people.
So instead of saying, hey, this isn't working for me,
Yeah.
we just bite our tongues.
Exactly.
Go along with things, keep the peace.
Right. And it might seem like the nice thing to do or the loving thing to do in the moment.
Right.
But over time, it can have some pretty bad consequences.
That makes sense.
And the thing is, self-abandonment isn't just an internal struggle.
Oh,
It can actually damage the relationships we're trying to protect.
I never thought of it like that. How does it affect things between people?
Well, the source points out that when we self-abandon, we start to build up resentment.
Oh, okay.
And we might not even realize it's happening at first.
Mm-hmm.
But all those unexpressed needs and bottled up emotions, they create this underlying tension and dissatisfaction.
So it's almost like a pressure cooker,
Exactly.
just waiting to explode.
Yeah. And then all that resentment can come out in passive aggressiveness,
Oh, I see.
or arguments over small things, or even a total communication breakdown.
Wow. And this source also talks about self-esteem, right?
Exactly. It highlights how self-abandonment chips away at our self-esteem.
Okay.
Because when we're constantly putting others' needs ahead of our own, we start to believe that our needs aren't important, that our voice doesn't matter.
And then it gets even harder to speak up in the future.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And the longer we stay in that cycle, the more we lose touch with who we really are.
We become almost like chameleons.
Yes. Constantly changing to fit other people's expectations.
So how do we start to even see these patterns in ourselves?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's tough to see the forest for the trees.
It really is, and that's where I think this source is so valuable.
Yeah.
It breaks down some really common patterns
Right.
that a lot of us will probably recognize.
Okay.
So one of the big ones is feeling overly responsible for other people's well-being.
Oh, yeah, those people who are always trying to fix everyone's problem.
Yes.
I know a few people like that. It never seems to end well.
And the source explains that compassion and support, those are crucial in any relationship.
Of course.
But there's this fine line between offering help and taking on the burden of somebody else's happiness.
Yeah.
And it's not about becoming cold or uncaring.
Okay.
But it's more about recognizing that we can't force someone to change or make different choices.
Right. We can support them.
Yes.
But
yeah.
ultimately, it's their journey.
Exactly.
So how do we know when we've crossed that line from supporting to rescuing?
The source has this great question it says to ask yourself.
Okay.
Am I trying to fix this because it's truly in their best interest?
Okay.
Or am I doing it because it makes me feel better, less anxious?
Wow. So it's about being honest about our own motivations.
Exactly. And being mindful of whether we're taking on more than we should.
That's a question I need to ask myself more often. What other patterns does this source talk about?
Another really common one is constantly seeking external validation.
Okay.
And this shows up as putting everyone else's needs and opinions ahead of your own in this constant search for approval.
So you're always trying to please everyone.
Yes.
Be the good one, the agreeable one, even if it means giving up what you want.
Exactly. And what the source points out, which is so interesting, is that this can actually be a really sneaky form of self-abandonment.
Okay.
Because on the surface, it can look like kindness or generosity.
Right.
But deep down, it's driven by this fear of rejection.
Yeah.
And this need to control how others see you.
So it's like we're trying to earn love.
Yes.
Instead of believing we deserve it just as we are.
Precisely. And to break free from this pattern, the source suggests noticing when we're saying yes.
Okay.
When we really want to say no.
Oh, I see.
Or when we're going along with things just to avoid making waves.
Yeah.
It's about starting to value our own voice, our own opinions.
Even if they're not what everyone wants to hear.
Exactly.
That reminds me, the source also talks about avoiding authentic expression.
Yes.
Because we're afraid of rejection or conflict.
Right. So this pattern is all about keeping the peace.
Okay.
Even if it means burying your real feelings.
Like we're wearing masks, pretending everything's okay.
Exactly.
When it's really not.
Right. And it might seem easier in the moment, but the source argues that this eventually leads to isolation and disconnection.
Because we're not letting people see the real us.
Exactly.
So before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to ask you, the listener, a question. Can you relate to any of this? Think about a time when you might have abandoned yourself in a relationship. What happened? It's okay to be honest. Recognizing those patterns, that's the first step to breaking free.
Absolutely.
And building those healthy, authentic connections.
Right.
And we'll talk more about that in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Yeah. It's really important to just acknowledge those moments. You know,
right.
where maybe we held back or didn't say anything
Yeah.
when we really wanted to.
Absolutely. That self-awareness is key to making a change. So we've been talking about how self-abandonment can show up in relationships.
Right.
But the cool thing is, this source doesn't just leave us hanging.
Yeah, exactly.
It actually gives us some really good advice
Yeah.
on how to change those patterns and build better connections.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most insightful points it makes is this distinction between rescuing someone and authentically supporting them.
That's interesting. So what does it say about authentic support? Because I think sometimes we get so caught up in helping that we end up enabling bad behaviors without even realizing it.
Yeah, it's like we think caretaking is the same as love.
Right.
But this source makes it clear that they're different. It says real support is about empowering people to face their challenges, to make their own choices, to learn from their experiences.
So it's less about swooping in to save the day.
Yes.
And more about just being there for them.
Exactly. Exactly. Like holding space for someone to go through their own thing, even if it's messy, even if it's uncomfortable, without trying to control how it turns out.
I can see how that would help people be more independent and stronger in the long run.
Yeah.
But how do we actually make that shift?
Yeah.
From rescuer to supporter.
It's tricky, I know.
It sounds good in theory, but harder to actually do.
Right. The source has some tips.
Okay.
And a really big one is setting boundaries.
Oh, boundaries, yeah.
And the cool thing is, it doesn't frame boundaries as like putting up walls or pushing people away.
Okay.
It's about respecting your own needs and limits. So you can actually be present and supportive without sacrificing your own well-being.
Right. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
You got to take care of yourself first.
Yeah.
Before you can really show up for others.
And the source says setting boundaries is a way of respecting yourself. It's about communicating clearly what you're okay with. If you're not okay with, what works for you and what doesn't.
So it's being able to say no without feeling guilty.
Exactly.
Or like you're letting someone down.
And it has this great affirmation.
Okay.
I am responsible for my own happiness, and I let others take responsibility for theirs.
Wow. That's really powerful. It's like a reminder that we can't control other people's feelings or choices.
Exactly. We can offer support and love, but their path is ultimately their own.
And if we try to take on that responsibility, we just end up burnt out and resentful.
Right, which, as we said, can actually damage the relationship.
So thinking about our listeners out there, think about your own relationships. Where might you be overstepping? Where could you create some space for yourself?
Yeah.
Remember, it's not selfish. It's actually essential.
Absolutely.
For having strong and fulfilling connections.
Yeah.
And speaking of fulfilling connections, I love how this source redefines intimacy.
Oh, yeah.
It challenges those ideas that intimacy is all about physical stuff or grand gestures. So what does it say about true intimacy?
It says it's about being seen, heard, understood at like a soul level, you know?
Wow.
It's about letting yourself be vulnerable
Okay.
and sharing those parts of yourself that you often hide.
Like taking off the masks and letting someone see the real you.
Exactly, exactly. And what's so interesting is that the source says embracing discomfort and challenges can actually make intimacy stronger.
Wait, discomfort? I thought the goal was to avoid conflict.
I know, it sounds kind of strange, but think about it.
Okay.
When you're willing to have those tough conversations, to deal with the difficult stuff, to work through those hard emotions together, it creates a bond that you just can't get from keeping things surface level.
It's like when you go through something hard with someone.